Hey guys, so I think today is the day that you should meet the new loom. Hi there, my name is Felicia from SweetGeorgia and welcome to Taking Back Friday. Every Friday we come here and we talk about knitting and spinning and weaving and dyeing and all those things about the fiber arts that I absolutely love. So today we are going to talk about the new loom. The new loom has been here for 43 days. It's been here for exactly 43 days. Now, as you can see, it kind of resides between our living room area over here and our dining room area over here. It's literally in the middle of our entire house, in the middle of our entire life. And it's massive. Like, I'm 5'2". It is this big, this deep, and pretty much this tall. So it takes up a cubic 5-foot area of space in this house. It's quite big. So when the loom first arrived, my husband and I ended up sharing many words about the duration of which this loom would reside in this location. This was the spot where our Christmas tree was. And basically, as soon as we had cleared out the Christmas tree, about 2 days later, the loom arrived in this very spot. So we had some words about what it meant to each one of us, what the word temporary meant. And so temporary situation for me was like a couple of months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. And for him, it was like 2 weeks. But then seeing as how I have the most supportive and wonderful husband in the whole world, he decided that the best thing to happen would be for this to stay here so that way I could get hopefully a little bit more weaving done in the mix of all of this stuff, in the midst of life, to be able to do more weaving. And so he was very supportive about that. Now, the trouble is that it has been here for 43 days and absolutely nothing is on it. So no weaving is currently happening on this loom. It is embarrassing. It's been here for 43 days and no weaving is currently happening on this loom. And the reason why is because I'm a little bit scared of the loom. I'm a little bit intimidated. Now, this is not the first ever floor loom I've ever worked with or ever owned. When I started learning how to weave, I used basically this exact same loom at Place des Arts when I learned to weave, and I wove my first blankets. I wove a mohair blanket and all these kinds of things. I started on a loom just like this. And I also have 2 floor looms upstairs in the attic that I've had for more than 10 years now. I think the baby wolf loom I got in 2009 when I reopened the studio, and the spring loom I got in 2008. So I've had those for about 10 years now. So I'm not unfamiliar with floor looms. I'm not unfamiliar with a jack loom. But it's just kind of getting a new loom is intimidating. I just don't know what to put on it. I'm not familiar with this particular loom. And so I keep wondering, what's the shed going to be like? Is it going to open? How is the brake band going to work? Is the brake band going to be functioning correctly? Because I had to reassemble that when I put the loom together. So I'm wondering if that's going to all work and how that all needs to be adjusted. But in any case, it's just that I need to get started on something and I keep procrastinating, and it's kind of killing me because this is right here in the middle of my life. The whole point of this being here is so that I would do more weaving, and it's all this hesitation and fear about starting something new, anything, and it's just preventing me from moving forward. So here's one story that I wanted to share with you guys that I've picked up in the past couple of years. I've heard this story told from a couple of different people, but the details are sometimes a little bit different, but overall the gist is the same. And so the story goes that there is a pottery class, and the teacher of this pottery class gave the class some instructions and said that at the end of this class, however many weeks or months long this class was, at the end of the class there was going to be a prize for the the students who made the best pots, whatever best means, right? And so in starting this class, he divided the class into 2 halves. And for one half, he instructed the students to do nothing but make one single perfect pot. And then to the other half of the students, he told them to make just as many pots as possible. And so at the end of the year, they would compare and see who made the best pots. So the first half of the class that were instructed to just make one perfect pot spent all their weeks and months basically researching, studying, theorizing, reading, just figuring out what they needed to do in order to make that perfect pot. The other half of the class spent all their time just making stuff. Just keep going, just keep trying, just keep churning things out, crank them out as many as fast as possible to see what you get. And so at the end of this course, where the students and the teacher come together and they do this final review of all the pots that have been made in the course. And they're looking at which ones are the best pots, the most effective pots, or the most consistent pots, the most attractive pots, whatever the criteria was. The best pots overall ended up being from the students who had focused on making as many pots as possible. And so thinking about this story and being reminded of this story makes me come back to this whole year-long theme that I have, which is to make this one epic cloth project. And so yes, this epic cloth project that I talked about in January, the very, very start of the year, is really about trying to make one big, massive, meaningful, intensely challenge-filled, just everything intentional about this one particular slow cloth, and to make it over 9 or 10 months and finish in September. Like, this is one big project that I'm wrestling with. And the internal struggle that I'm going is that I'm trying to make this one perfect thing, and it's causing paralysis, right? It's causing this creative paralysis and this feeling like I can't make it unless it's absolutely perfect. And so this, I believe, is where the story and this loom come into play. So when this loom came to me, it came to me as a gift. It literally fell from the sky and landed in my lap in this living room. And so for the past 43 days, I've been sort of racking my brain to figure out, what can I make with this loom that is meaningful, that is intentional, that reflects and honors the gift that it is? And I think that what I've come to is this. My weaving goals for this year include making that one amazing, epic project that I'm trying to make. That's one piece of the puzzle. The other thing that I need to do is to weave as many projects as I possibly can. And I want to do that with this particular loom. So in a previous video, I talked a lot about how I didn't want to just weave a whole bunch of random things anymore. I really wanted to be intentional and weave things with a sort of a purpose. Not necessarily a purpose like I would wear them or use them or have a functional purpose or anything like that, but move me forward in terms of what I'm learning. And so I have been reading Laura Fry's new book. It's called The Intentional Weaver, and it's so good. It is literally like having Laura stand next to you and describe and talk about every little thing that she's doing as she does it. So I've been reading the part about warping and winding a warp, and even how she holds her fingers as she holds her warp, and all these kinds of things. And she said that when she starts a new technique, she gives herself 7 warps to learn that technique through and through. And so it's this idea of just putting on as many warps as you can to get that practice, to just keep going and just keep making something. And that moves your skill forward. That moves your knowledge and your experience forward. And so one of the things that I have been not haunted by, but just obsessed with is warp-faced weaving. Just basically having all of your warp threads squished together really, really tight so that the colors of those warp threads come forward and they become much more apparent. So that's part of what I want to do for the Epic project, but that's also what I want to do for the projects on this loom, is basically to use this loom to do a lot more sampling, to weave a lot more of this fabric, a lot more of these warps, just to go through the process more and more so that I can practice. So if you don't know what rep weave is or have never heard of it, it's basically, I don't know if you can see from this book. Yeah. So you can see sort of this is sort of the style of rep weave, which is basically a warp face weaving technique. All of these warp threads are much more prominent. The color of the warp threads is much more prominent, and you can barely see the weft, the yarn that's going here. You can barely see the color of that because it's being covered almost entirely by the warp threads. And so then you can start to make very, very prominent designs with the colors of your warp rather than having the two interplay too much. They still do interplay, but not as much. So this is kind of the thing that I want to be doing more of with this particular loom. And so in order to get started with that, what I have is I have all this cotton yarn that I ordered last year from Penelope, from Brenda Glass at Penelope Fiber Arts. And my goal was to dye all of it. It's all white yarn. And so what I need to do for my next step is to take all of those skeins of this cotton yarn, this stuff here. And this is the 4/8 or 8/4, 4/8, depends on if you're US or if you're Canadian. But basically this cotton yarn, I'm gonna wind off into 100-gram skeins and then dye them all with fiber reactive dyes into like a palette of different colors so that I can mix and blend in order to make the warps that are gonna go onto this particular loom. I also have some other weaving projects going on because, like I said, I believe that this is absolutely something that's going to work, because since I got my rigid heddle loom set up on a loom stand, I can sit here in the living room and do my weaving every evening. And through that, I managed to finish this. So this wrap is basically the strawberry tea color in the mohair silk DK. And I just crossed it with a strand of mohair, like mohair, very fine mohair that I had from like a long, long time ago. And I dyed that in the lollipop colorway. And so most of this is lollipop and strawberry tea mixed together. And there's a tiny little bit of the thicker mohair yarn that was left over from the mohair blankets that I made. And I just popped that in the end because I wanted to see what this fabric felt like. And I feel like this feels like a really nice blanket fabric. This is still really light and drapey, makes a nice scarf, nice warp. It was a snow day yesterday, so it's nice to stay cozy. But yeah, I absolutely believe that this is going to work, because if this is right here in the middle of everything, I think I'll actually do it. But before I can do it, I need yarn. And before I can get the yarn, I need to dye it. So this is a multi-step process to get all these things done. The other thing that I'm working on is upstairs, the spring loom, where I cut off that mohair blanket that I worked on a couple months ago. I have so much mohair left over. This is just a little bit of the mohair that I still have left over from weaving that blanket. I have so much mohair left over and I want to use it. Again, this is part of the theme of this year, is to have no new yarn, but to use the stuff that's in my stash. So one of these things is to use these yarns. And also from Penelope last year, I ordered this stuff. This is actually Harrisville Shetland yarn. It's a 2-ply, 100% Shetland wool. It's not particularly strong. It's a woolen spun yarn. So yeah, it's a woolen spun 2-ply yarn. It looks like it's about fingering weight. You can break it really easily. So, you know, spinning to make a really worsted and smooth yarn makes strength. It builds strength into that yarn. When it's woolen spun like this, it's very lofty and very airy and very light, but it breaks really easily because it doesn't have that kind of strength. And that's fine. You just have to weave it more gently. If you're knitting with this, then it's also not a problem. But that's kind of the nature of this kind of yarn. So with that combination, the Harrisville Shetland and the mohair, I wanted to put another blanket onto the spring loom that's upstairs, because all of that stuff has already been threaded through the heddles. It's all pretty much ready to go. And I thought, rather than taking it all off and starting something new, why don't I just use what's already there and continue and make another blanket? But because I wanted to change the set a little bit, with my previous mohair blanket, it was warped at 6 ends per inch. And this one I wanted to weave at 8 ends per inch. And since I didn't want to actually start weaving and just wait and see what happens, I decided to do a sample. So I got this. This is from Purl and Loop. This is called the Swatchmaker. The Swatchmaker 3-in-1. And so it has notches up here, it has holes here, and it has holes down here. So these notches are basically 8 ends per inch. The holes in the middle are 10 ends per inch, and the holes down here are 12 ends per inch. So basically you can warp this at 8 ends, 10 ends, 12 ends, and then weave a little sample. So that's what I did here. I set it up for 8 ends per inch, and I used this Shetland, the Harrisville Shetland for the warp, and then I just wove with a little needle back and forth by hand, manually with a little needle. I wove that mohair yarn in here as the weft. And then the most important thing to do is to cut it off and wash it and see if you like it. And you know what? I love it. It feels so good. It's so squishy good. So I have some plans about what I want to do with this. So yesterday was a snow day. So me and the kids, we stayed home. We played in the snow. We made our snowman. We got on the snowboard. We toddled around the backyard. But then I also wound some warps. And so this is the Harrisville Shetland. This has been wound into a warp that is 3 yards, a little bit more than 3 yards long. And I have wound 6 of them. So basically I split up the number of ends. There's 264 ends. I split them up into 6 groups. And each of these warps, I'm going to dip dye into a different colorway and then weave them all together. So that's what's going to go up next on the spring loom upstairs. So that's about it right now. I mean, I am knitting full steam ahead on that copper and candlewax shawl, just working through that, but then finishing this project on the rigid heddle. I'm going to put another project on the rigid heddle. Another project's going to go on the spring loom. Another project's going to go on here. Lots of projects going on, lots of planning going on, lots of project planning going on. So yeah, this Friday for the crafternoon for the School of Sweet Georgia, I'm basically going to sit down and do a live stream where I walk through the process of how I do mock-ups and design mock-ups in Illustrator and InDesign for my projects. Here you can see a little mock-up of the blanket that I'm trying to make with that Harrisville Shetland and mohair yarn. So hopefully it'll look somewhat like what it looks like here. So this week is really all about just having that reminder of, what can you do to get better? What can you do to get over that paralysis by analysis and just keep moving forward with your creative projects? Just keep going. One of the things that happened this week was I was interviewed for a magazine about lever knitting because several years ago, 2011, 2012, I took a workshop with Stephanie Pearl McPhee about how to knit with more speed and more efficiency. And she taught lever knitting. She taught Irish cottage style lever knitting. And so I learned that from her, but I'd also learned lever knitting before. And so I was being interviewed for this magazine article about lever knitting. And the questions were all kind of around, how do you get started? How do you get better? How do you get faster? All of these kinds of things. And I just found myself writing that the more you do it, the better you'll get. Basically, just keep practicing. And I think that is just the reminder here. Like, if I want to get better at weaving, all I need to do is sit down and do more of it. That's it. Put on more warps, one and over and over and over and over again. That's basically it. I would love to hear from you guys. Let me know in the comments below if there's any place where you feel like you're stuck in your creative process. I would love to hear about how you get through that, how you keep moving forward, how you start new projects, all of that stuff. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really, really appreciate you coming here to watch this every week. It's so fun to make. And if you haven't seen it yet, also our very first sort of kickoff teaser episode of the podcast came out this past week as well. So you can find that on iTunes and also on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you guys so much for being here again. Please do hit like if you like this episode, and please do hit subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. I talk about the fiber arts, basically how knitting and spinning and weaving and dyeing and all these things mix together and make this giant circle of life. Thank you guys so much for being here. I guess I will see you guys in the next one. All right, bye for now.